Off Maxey.
I'm Gary Snyder-Kristoff.
Out to Chase Berry for three. Rebound by Peyton Crispin. He's going to put it back. And hits.
They got it!
The Lakers hit three.
Welcome back again. Music Court, home of your SWOCC Lakers.
Can't get the shot to go. The Lakers win the ball game. Goal! Lakers win! Lakers win in overtime. 108-106.
Do you like to work with metal, fire, electricity? Would you like to make money doing it? At Southwestern, we can help make your dream a reality. With our degree and certificate programs in welding, you'll be prepared for a career in the welding and fabrication industry in as little as a year. Check out our website and let Southwestern spark your career in welding today.
I'm Private First Class Taylor Irwin, and I'm with the Maryland Army National Guard. I joined the Army National Guard to begin my career. So I have been awarded tuition assistance, and I picked furthering my education. Right now we're just going through the basics. We're doing the confidence course. It's to get over your fears basically and to see how far your team has come. It takes a strong leader and strong drill sergeants as well. You're gonna meet some really cool people and they're gonna help you get through it either way. So it's gonna be really fun.
This is Southwestern's Dental Assisting Program. In just one short year, you could be a dental assistant. Sign up now for your one-year dental assisting certification.
Congratulations, you just got accepted into college. Now, how do you pay for it? Fortunately, there are several options out there to consider. Follow this simple step-by-step guide as you figure out how to pay for college. Step 1, fill out your FAFSA? Free application for federal student aid, FAFSA. Your FAFSA will determine if you qualify for financial aid, including grants, some scholarships, work study, and federal student loans. The good news is, most people qualify for some financial aid, which is why this is the most important step in figuring out how to pay for college. Step 2, figure out how much you may need to borrow by weighing your college costs versus your contributions, including any grants or scholarships. Some easy arithmetic will make your math teachers proud. Let's say your college of choice costs $30,000 a year after factoring in tuition, housing, books, lab fees, and a laptop. Now, let's pretend that the money found in your family swear jar, your bowling scholarship, your federal grant, and the money you saved as a scuba instructor contributes $10,000 to your college fund. Voila! This is how much you will need to cover through other means. Many families consider student loans a reliable option. Step 3. There are two categories of student loans you can consider, federal and private. Federal loans are made by the government and private loans are made by private lenders. In some cases, families use both to cover the cost of college. Compare student loan options by looking at their interest rates, repayment options, and fees. Interest rates vary depending on the loan type. Federal loan rates are fixed, while private loan rates can be fixed or variable and are determined by your credit quality. Adding a co-signer, like mom and dad, may help lower your interest rate. Repayment options for federal and private loans are also different. Some providers require in-school payments, some don't. Take a look at these now and choose an option that makes sense for you. Watch out for fees. Fees can be charged upfront or in repayment, and they add to the total cost of the loan, so you end up paying more back. Step 4. Factor in other benefits when researching a loan. Some reduce your interest rate and some give you cash back. For example, Discover student loans have no fees and give you a cash reward for a 3.0 GPA or equivalent. Let's go through these steps one more time, just in case you needed a refresher. Step 1, fill out your FAFSA. Step 2, weigh your school cost versus your contributions. Maximize any free money like personal savings, grants, and scholarships before considering loans. Step 3, compare interest rates, repayment options, and fees. Step 4, take into account any benefits the loan provider may offer. Don't forget that you can continue to reduce the amount you need to borrow with scholarships. If you are an eligible current or college-bound student, you can enter to win a $2,500 Discover Student Loan Scholarship Award. Head over to collegecovered.com to learn more about paying for college and enter to win. No purchase or loan required. The first week of school can always be a bit overwhelming, but a little bit of good old college ingenuity can go a long way. Here are 10 collegiate quality hacks that will make campus life a little more comfortable.
No giant me. Thank you. Now I can go back to being anonymous me, and for that, I am very grateful. So thank you all for making time in your schedule tonight. This is the last of 6 talks in the geology lecture this year, which affectionately is known as the year of the ocean, because essentially everything has had some overtone of marine conditions, whether it be geology or this evening, more biology and life. So it's been a really exciting year, and every year I wonder how it gets any better. But part of that is finding the right people that are willing to take a chance on coming out to Coos Bay. We could do 5 minutes on that this evening, but we won't, and it just is an inside joke. But I am very, 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 very grateful to have not only representatives, including Trish Mace from the Charleston Marine Life Center, out in the lobby. If you didn't see them on the way in, they'll be around for a little bit on the way out as well, bringing some actual specimens of extreme life of the sea into our lobby. But also that Steve actually got here today makes me very, very happy. So occasionally people ask me, where do you get these folks? And so this year has not only been the year of the ocean, it's been the year of IRIS, which is a seismological group. It's been the year of the Ocean Drilling Program, who brought us a speaker. And it's also been the year of NPR. So Shannon, back a couple months ago, came here because I heard her and one of her research colleagues on Science Friday while I was traveling. And when I first heard Steve was on a TED Talk, and so from our very own JPR. And so I was really thrilled when we finally got a time when Steve was able to make it out here. So Steve started his teaching career at the University of Hawaii, went about as far away in the US as you can get, and spent some time at Harvard University. You may be familiar with them. And then went to the Harvard of the West, as it were. We actually are connected that way. My advisor went to Stanford as well. Not Tiger Woods, but he did go on a golf scholarship, which for a geologist is pretty intriguing. So Steve came up from San Francisco Airport today, from Stanford, to talk to you this evening. His list of accomplishments, I would just suggest Googling him, because if I had spent any amount of time covering any of it, we would be at about 7:30 already, and I'm not going to do that to you. I would like to thank a couple other sponsors. I'd like to thank the college for providing the space, and also for providing our IT staff that has done an outstanding job, and I know that if I don't say it now, I'll probably forget later. But thanks to them, because not only do they make the experience great here, but they also provide the live stream feed, which every year more and more people either watch it live, or if they can't attend, end up being able to watch it as it's archived from the college website as well. If you didn't sign these, a couple people asked this, if you would take a second on your way out to sign, I'd appreciate it. It helps me justify these things. There are a number of free speaker series that would like to have 200 people, and if I can make sure that most of you sign, it helps me prove if they ever call me out on that. The one other thing is I have 2 copies, one hard copy of Extreme Life of the Sea, still available for sale, and one copy of Death and Life of Monterey Bay, both by Steve Palumbi, one with his son and one with another author. And he'd be willing to sign those afterwards, $30 cash or check. I don't have the ability to do plastic. So thank you all for attending tonight. And next talk in this series is in October, and it will be at least the first half of the year of the earthquake. And if you're interested, how many of you saw Scott Fisher, my partner in science, Aaron Coiner, the professor of physics, invited Scott from University of Oregon over here last year to do an astronomy talk. He'll be in town on June 6th. It's a Thursday, same place, 7 p.m. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you this evening Steve Palumbi.
Thanks very, very much, Ron, and for everything you did to organize this, get me here, bring all you here, and the sponsors and old friends in Oregon and folks from all over. Thanks very, very much. And I know for all the things that Ron was saying about the kinds of work that we all do. This is just one of my favorite things. Writing books, especially writing books with my son, and then talking about it, and then just meeting people that get excited about the stuff in the ocean. Tony and I were approached by a publisher to write a book about the life in the ocean. Right? It just sounds so ponderous and awful. And so we thought, well, what we're going to do to make it interesting, and what would we really want to write about? We could just write about that. And so the topic, the extreme life of the sea, sort of came up. It came from Tony, really. And we initially thought about these kinds of creatures, because what's more extreme than white sharks doing this? But it turns out, they're not that extreme. They're not the fastest fish in the ocean. They're not the biggest. They're not the fiercest. They're not the most powerful. They do bite, that's for sure. But I'll tell you a little bit later about what they're really good at in being extreme. But the real topic was the kinds of secrets that marine biologists know about the ocean and what's in them, and the kinds of critters that are there. So we really had a lot of fun digging into what we knew about marine biology, what we knew about these organisms, then learning a huge amount on top of that to sort of bring them to life. And the idea here is to try to show why the science of the ocean and the science of marine biology is really interesting, but not overdo it, because it turns out their creatures are interesting in and of themselves. So the mix has been really cool. But I know that it's Friday evening. It's a geology series. And I thought, well, got to bring us all up to speed in marine biology. And so here's 47 seconds of marine biology just to get us all started. There, now you're all card-carrying marine biologists. That was 87 different marine species. It's all in your brain now. And the music, by the way, is my daughter's rock and roll band. So I live in Monterey Bay, and like you folks live here, you have the chance to see that kind of stuff where you live. And you know, when you see these sorts of creatures and what it is they do, there's just an awe that comes along with it. These critters, you know, just throwing themselves out of the water, are an amazing way of displaying not just to us, but to the other whales that are right there. But what is it? So it's a whale. What whale is this? It's a humpback. So how do you know it's a humpback whale? Star Trek, yeah. How do you know that it's a humpback? What gives it away? Exactly, the fins. The fins give it away. Humpback whales have the longest fins of any baleen whale. They're about up to a third of the length of the animal. And it's a little strange because these animals are also incredible migrators. They move 6,000 to 7,000 miles twice a year, back and forth, breeding and feeding grounds. And although those fins are big and they have a lot of drag, and that seems odd that you'd be swimming that far and have all these incredible fins, but they use them in their acrobatics, so that's kind of the usefulness of them. But the other odd thing about them that really puzzled whale biologists for a long time were the bumps. Because not only are they big and long because they have a lot of drag, those bumps make them even have more drag and make it more ungainly to swim thousands and thousands of miles with them. So the question was, why do whale fins have these bumps on them when it's clearly such a bad idea? So a set of marine biologists did what they could do, say, well, how bad is it really? How much extra drag comes from those bumps? So they made a model of the fin with the bumps, and they measured the drag on that, and then they cut the bumps off, and they measured the drag, and the drag went up. The bumps didn't create more drag, the bumps reduced the drag of the fins because they constrain the way the water moves across the fins, and they make it less turbulent. So the know-it-all marine biologists were simply wrong. The whales were right about the bumps. And then the engineers decided that they could be right too. So they started making blades, fan blades, with bumps on them. So this is a kind of a fan blade being developed in Canada right now. It has about 35% more efficiency than regular fan blades because those bumps are at the leading edge of the fin, and they work like the bumps on humpback whale fins to reduce the drag. So it's just a little story of a little bit of science and a little bit of just curiosity about what's in the ocean and the kinds of things that come out from it. So we get to be in lots of different strange places as marine biologists. This is one of my favorite study sites in American Samoa. Usually wear a shirt and tie under the water like that, but it was a bet that I had with the film producer that was there that we could just make a portrait underwater that way. And again, there's just some fun things you can do in the ocean with the diversity that's all there. And it really focuses our attention on like, well, what is there? How do we look at it, and how do we do it in a slightly different way? So we were thinking more about sharks again, and thinking about Shark Week and how unfair it was that there was Shark Week and we were going to have to compete against that. So Tony and I did put an op-ed in the LA Times during Shark Week for the most vicious marine animal we could think of, which was not a shark at all, but this small snail, cone snail. Cone snails are only a couple inches long, but they are the only mollusk that eats vertebrates. They eat fish. They hide under the sand, and when a fish comes by, they sort of rear up and they harpoon it with a modified tooth. The modified teeth look like that. I know, right? Worse, they're connected to the salivary glands. The salivary glands have a venom in them. Now, if you're a snail under the sand and you're going to harpoon a fish, the fish cannot twitch, or else it'll just boom, go away, and you can't chase it. You can't find it again. So the venom in the snail salivary gland, called conotoxin, is an incredible neurotoxin. It snaps into those fish, and it simply shuts down all their nervous transmission instantly. So the conotoxin has been isolated, it's been sequenced, it's a protein, and then has been in testing now for a replacement painkiller. It's about 1,000 times more powerful than morphine as a painkiller, and has a very different role and a very different way of acting. So again, the biology of these animals leads to looking at them in a different way, understanding how they manage to do what they do. So you don't have to go to sharks to be extreme, but given that we're talking about sharks enough, what is it that they really are extreme about? And then this is what they're really extreme about, not the mouth and not the jaws, but the teeth. They invented teeth. Before sharks, 420 million years ago, fish didn't have teeth. They had beaks. They were called placoderms. Sharks invented teeth. It's been a very, very, very good invention for them. It's stood them well for over mass extinction after mass extinction. But it's actually a really hard thing to grow something that sharp. I mean, this is a white shark tooth. It's 3 to 5 times sharper than a razor blade. And when we want to make something sharp, how do we do it? We make it thin, and then we might buff it or pound it or polish it to make it thin. Well, the sharks can't do that. They have to grow it thin. So they grow these teeth to be incredibly sharp, and they wear out because they get dull. So they grow whole lines of teeth, not just one, not just the teeth that are being used, but all kinds of lines of teeth. And they grow like this. They come out of the throat as little bumps, and then they grow up towards the jaw, and they get bigger and bigger and bigger. Then when they're ready, the old teeth fall out, and the new teeth flip into place. So whenever the old teeth get old enough so that they're no longer sharp, they grow these new sharp ones, and then deploy them for the next little bit. So that's how they solve this problem of needing really sharp teeth, growing them, and then not being able to keep them sharp as they go. And it's been their way of doing this for 400 million years, and it makes shark teeth some of the most common fossils in the world because they're shedding teeth all the time. They fall to the bottom, they fossilize. So you might see shark teeth around here. You might see them in fossil shows, and that's why, because there's so many of them. So we sort of got into the topic of, what's the sharpest? What's the longest? What are the ests? And so I just want to sort of go through some of the ests, some of the things that we really found were interesting, exciting, and different than what we had thought. Like the fastest. What are the fastest things in the ocean? How do they move? How do they get that way? And so we started with flying fish. Flying fish, it turns out, it's a lie. They don't fly. They have wings like this. The wings are modified swimming fins, and they don't flap. They don't have the muscles that birds and bats do to allow their fins to flap. So they're gliders, not flyers. So that's one thing. Then the other is that they're pretty fast, but only in the air, not in the water. So do they really count as the fastest fish? They're not the fastest fish. In fact, they're really slow in the water. They're only fast above water. Why do they go out of water at all? So why do they go out of the water at all? To escape, exactly. What are they escaping from? Those, exactly. So mahi-mahi and other things, but mahi-mahi are the fish that have the most flying fish in their stomachs of any other fish. So they're good at catching them. And mahi-mahi can swim as fast as flying fish can glide. So that sets up a conflict. And we're writing a book with Tony, who's a novelist. We're looking for scenes with characters and conflict resolution, because that's what novelists do. That's what they write about. So here's the conflict. The flying fish is out of the water. It's scared out of the water by the mahi-mahi and is flying along. Well, the mahi is swimming right under it. Now let's go back to gliding. What happens when you glide? You come down. So the flying fish is coming down with the mahi right under it, and the mahi is just pacing it, waiting for it to hit the water. And when it does hit the water, flying fish can do this. They have a lower end of their tail that's longer than the upper end, and when that tail hits the water, they can burst forward and then get back up in the air again. And a really good flying fish can do that 3 or 4 times in a row before finally getting exhausting and having to go back in the water. So this is the point where the mahi can strike, because there's something in the water it can strike at. But if it strikes and misses, the mahi's stopped and the flying fish gets away. So the drama is the mahi coming under the flying fish coming down and kicking back up, and the mahi keeping along with it. And so in the book we sort of describe this race. Over and over, you see the flying fish hitting the ocean, and then off in the distance, you see this huge splash. The marine biologist would tell you exactly what happened, but the novelist won't. So you novelists leave it to their imagination what happened out there. The important thing is the conflict and what's really going on. So I leave it to your imagination what happened. What do you want to have happen in that encounter? So they're not the fastest fish, but what is? Because there really is some really fast fish out there, and these are the real winners. This is a sailfish. It's clocked at 60 miles an hour, and it eats at 40 miles an hour. So they're incredibly fast fish, and we looked all over for video of these fish swimming at 40 miles an hour, because it'd be so cool, and we had a contract to do videos for the book. So we looked and looked and looked, and this is the best I could do. This is not 60 miles an hour at all. This is about 15 miles an hour. We'll just take a step back and do it again. See the fish coming in, it's batting at the bait with its bill, and then turning, snapping, and then it sort of falls away. This is a fishing boat in Costa Rica. So that was really interesting to see what they're really doing. They're not spearing the fish with that bill, they're batting at the fish with that bill. And that means that they are batting and turning and gulping very, very, very quickly. We still really wanted to see what this fish looked like at 40 miles an hour, just to imagine what that would be. That's 15, like I said. So, and the deadline was approaching. We were getting a little desperate. Actually, we're getting very desperate. So this is what we did. I borrowed a stuffed marlin from a friend and tied it to the top of my car. And we ran it up and down the Carmel Valley at 40 miles an hour, filming it to see what that looked like. So I'm going to show you what that looks like. All right, come on. There we go. Okay. All right. Did you catch that? You want to see that again? Right. So, I mean, that's why. Yeah. That's why you don't see a video of fish going 40 miles an hour, because that's how fast it is. So they're really moving at 40 miles an hour. And you can see why, because they've got, they're streamlined, they have all this muscle, and so they can really haul. But they're also having to eat at 40 miles an hour. So that is the other thing. Their bill is 2 feet in length, 40 miles an hour is 60 feet a second, 2 feet, 60 feet a second. They have a 1/30th of a second to hit a fish at the tip and then turn and gulp it down as they go past. So that's really challenging. Not only for two reasons. You have to see the prey going at 40 miles an hour because you're moving very quickly, and you have to process the information of what's there. So sailfish and billfish in general have adaptations we never really even thought about. They have heaters. They have heaters on their eyeballs because they're cold water fish, and at cold waters their eyeballs just don't function fast enough in order to be able to see at 40 miles an hour. So they heat up the back of their eyes, their retinas, so their retinas can see better, going really quickly. And then they also have heaters on their optic lobes in their brains, so their brains can process that information fast enough. Between the muscles and the streamlining and the bills and the heaters, they can swim and eat at this speed. But it takes all of them together because it doesn't do you any good to be able to move really fast if you can't feed at that speed. And that speed too. So that's sort of the story of the fastest. But that's a lifestyle, it's not a place. There's places in the ocean that are extreme that organisms have to really adapt strongly to get there. And this is one such place. It's the hottest place that animals live on the planet. These are hydrothermal vents. They're down thousands of meters deep between the tectonic plates of the ocean, so that's the geology part of today's talk. And in those tectonic plates that are spreading, hot water blooms out. Those plumes there are coming out at up to 650 degrees centigrade. Now, they're not flashing into steam because of the incredible pressure down there, but the heat is incredible. And then the black part is chemicals falling out of the water when it cools down. These places are home of amazing creatures like these vestimentiferan tube worms that grow incredibly quickly, and they have no sunlight to power them. It's not an ecosystem based on photosynthesis like every other ecosystem on Earth. This is an ecosystem based on chemosynthesis, creating food energy from the chemicals in that hot water. And Craig Young, who's here, is the director of the OIMB next door, has spent his career looking in the deep sea at places like this where these critters live. I was intrigued not by these, because lots of people have written about these, but by some of the lesser known ones, particularly a worm named after a submarine. It's called the Alvinella worm, named after the submarine Alvin. And what intrigues me about this is that it lives really close to these hot smokers. Lives in one of the hottest environments of any animal on the planet. And that so much of the tail end of the worm is living at the temperature of hot tea. But the head of the worm is out in the cold ocean, currents going by, and it's basically at the temperature of cold beer. So this worm builds a body, and it's only about an inch long, where it can function at the temperature of hot tea at one end and cold beer at the other end. We don't know how to do that from a biotechnological point of view. We don't know how to make a protein that can function at all those different temperatures, or nerves, or a digestive system, or anything like that. But this worm has it figured out. And so people have been decoding the genome of this worm to try to figure out how it has adapted, not to the hot temperature just by itself, but to this range of temperatures bigger than any other range that I know of for animals like this. But this is just hot, and there's plenty of places, more places actually, that are really cold. And lots of research has gone on in places like Antarctica and the poles that look at the problems of living in really, really cold water. And so this is one of those problems. This is, I think, a fabulous photo by John Weller, who allowed us to use it in the book. And you see what this is the ocean bottom in Antarctica. It's about 80 feet deep. The water is crystal clear, so you don't even know it's there. And those clouds in the sky are the ice that's on top of the water above you. Now, starfish are there. They're fine. But this water is colder than freezing. It's -2 degrees. And it's only not freezing because of the salt content of the water. But in the winter, even at normal seawater salinities, ice crystals begin to grow. So those white animals there growing on the bottom are not animals, they're ice crystals. And over the winter, they slowly grow by accreting and building on one another over the course of the whole winter. So that's a normal cycle in this really incredibly cold place in the Antarctic. And so you're not a starfish, you're an ice fish. You're an ice fish and you have blood, and your blood is just as salty as our blood, which is about 8 parts per thousand, not 35 parts per thousand like seawater. And at that salinity, your blood would freeze solid at -2 degrees centigrade. But these ice fish make up 95% of all the fish biomass in the Antarctic, so they have figured it out. They don't freeze solid in the winter. So a whole set of folks down in Antarctica have began looking at why these fish don't do that. It turns out they have a set of proteins that are called antifreeze proteins. And these fish don't have hemoglobin in their blood. Their blood isn't red, it's clear. Instead of being full of hemoglobin, their blood is really full of this ice, this antifreeze protein. And what it does is it gloms onto the ice crystals that are there, that form in the blood, and prevents those ice crystals from growing. So it basically is in the blood, ice forms, they stick to it. Other fish have it. Some fish in the northern Atlantic have it. These are Atlantic eel pouts. They're very cute. They're not really cute. This is just an unusual picture of them. But they also have this ice crystal protein, where the protein coats the ice of these fish. And that makes it possible then for the fish to live throughout the winter, because whenever the ice forms, it's walled off. And then the blood is filtered by the spleen, and all the ice crystals go into the spleen. And in the summer, when the water temperature goes up again, then they melt. And then starts all over again. So this is the filtering system that the Antarctic fish have. But people started looking at those antifreeze proteins for what else they would be useful for, because they don't need, you can make them. We know the amino acid sequence. And so the sequence from this Atlantic eel pout, that guy, was cloned, and it was put into yeast, and the product there, called ice-suppressing protein product, was used to solve one of the chief technical problems in our modern world, and that's, what about ice crystals forming in your ice cream, right? And how do we stop that? So in fact, especially in light ice cream, where there's not much fat and no egg yolks, ice crystals form much, much more quickly in light ice cream than regular ice cream. So a little bit of ice-suppressing protein product, so little that you don't have to put it on the label, can go into that and prevent that from happening. So from the Atlantic eel pout to your light ice cream, we have something that makes things better. And without that, the ice fish wouldn't have 95% of the biomass of fish in the Antarctic. They basically couldn't live there at all. Well, that just brings us again to looking at the lifestyles of these organisms and what it is they're doing. Ice fish then, like, they store up the ice in their spleens and then they melt it out in the summer, and like, what kind of strange life is that? But other things about ocean life then come to mind, like to ask, well, we tend to think of organisms in terms of their entire life cycle, especially in how long they tend to live. And we have some ideas about that based upon trout a lot of the time, that, a fish this big lives a couple of years, and that's that. But that's not necessarily the case, and the question is, how do we tell how long marine organisms live? That's a golden-eye rockfish. It lives deep along California coast and this coast, a couple hundred yards deep. They're a big part of the deep water rockfish fishery. They're called red snapper when they're brought up. And how do you figure out the right way of catching them, the right intensity of catching them, if you don't know how long they live? Does that fish who's that big, is that a 10-year-old fish or what? So people tried to figure that out, and they were a little stymied about it. Greg Kaye at Moss Landing Marine Lab in California promoted a way of doing it that takes advantage of something that was a unique event, luckily, in the history of the world, that is a whole series of atomic bomb tests that started in the late 1940s and ran into the mid-1960s. We started them in Bikini Atoll in 1948. We finished in 1958. The French and the British kept going for a little while longer. In that period of time, the open-air blasts of atomic bombs and hydrogen bombs, particularly hydrogen bombs, created radioactive isotopes that went all over the planet. So C14 is a radioactive isotope of carbon. It's made in nova explosions, and it's made a little bit by cosmic rays hitting the atmosphere. It's also made in hydrogen bombs. So over that period of time, we doubled the amount of CO2 in the planet, and it went everywhere, and it went into us, and everything in the ocean, everything. Even now, after a decay rate of about 60 years, there's still about 20% more C14 in all of us right now than there would have been before then. Well, this curve means that you can place the age of something if you can get a sample of it at its different ages. And that's what's shown here on the bottom. This is an ear bone of a fish called an otolith. And that ear bone in the center is where the fish, that's the ear bone size when the fish was born. And as it grows, it accretes it, and it accretes it in rings, sort of like tree rings. So if you cut through that otolith and you measure the radioactivity in each of those bands, you're measuring the radioactivity of that fish at its different ages. So this is an incredibly clever thing that Greg figured out. And then he could take that and put it up against that curve, and he could use the pattern in the otolith to tell exactly when that otolith was formed. And if the center of the otolith did not have C14 in it, then it meant the fish was younger, it was born before 1948. So that's what they did, and what they found by doing this is that goldeneye rockfish don't live to be 10 years old in that size, they live to be 100 years old, and they're that size. They live a very long time, they grow very slowly, and as a consequence, their population turnover is a lot slower than people thought. So it's still possible to fish them, you just have to fish them in a different way at a different rate in order to be sustainable, because all of a sudden you know that they're growing much more slowly than you thought they did. You can sort of, age stories are sort of just cool. Like fish, fine, 100-year-old fish. Well, what's the oldest mammal? Turns out bowhead whales are the oldest mammal, but we didn't know that either. We thought bowhead whales, which live in the northern Pacific, we thought they were 50 or 60 or 70 years old at maximum. There's a hunt of bowhead whales by the Inuits in northern Canada every year for Aboriginal purposes. And then one year, 1993, a humpback whale a bowhead whale was caught, and it had this in it. This is a brass harpoon. No one has thrown a brass harpoon at a bowhead whale for a century. Later on, they actually found a stone-tipped harpoon in a different bowhead whale. So that clued in whale biologists that maybe these whales lived a lot longer than people thought. And then by doing some other chemistry of their bodies, like Greg did with C14, bowhead whales now we know live to 120, 130, 140 years of age. Males live a little bit longer, but females are living and having young at 100 years of age in this species. That's good news for bowheads because it means that a female has a very long reproductive life, so that's good, but it also means they're actually, we know that they mature pretty late in life. But they're not the highest end of even vertebrate life. That is new. This is new information. This is a really ugly shark called a Greenland shark. They live to, they get to be about 15 meters long. They grow very slowly. They live basically under the ice in the Arctic Circle. They might come south to Greenland in the northern Atlantic every once in a while. But an animal that's 15 yards long was probably born in the 1600s. So that's about a 300-year-old shark. Greenland sharks are the oldest known vertebrates now, and they're projected to have a maximum lifespan of well over 500 years. They live at a very different pace. They swim very slowly. They grow very slowly. And again, a very different way of living throughout their whole life. Still, we're sort of creeping up on ages, right? 500 years is a very, very, very long time for a shark or a vertebrate, but this is actually the winner of the oldest animal on the planet. This species of golden coral living on the slopes of Hawaii. They live about 1,000 feet deep and deeper. They live in very calm water, very, very even temperatures, not much slight current. They grow a half of a hair's width a year. And animals that are about this big, about 6 to 8 feet tall, one of my colleagues, Ron Dunbar, has calculated them to be on the order of 4,000 years old. The one he has records for is 4,270 years old. So these animals are older than some of the pyramids. And they live in a very different pace. They live a very different life. A little bit of dredging in these environments would basically not be able to be repaired for decades, centuries, millennia is what it would take to repair them. So as we dig into these lifestyles and what these organisms really do, then we can adjust how we use the oceans to better fit what it is their lifestyles are and what it is they can actually do in terms of growth and regeneration. So it's a good use of this research in addition to kind of being awe-inspiring. And then comes back to these kind of critters that I showed you at first, really awe-inspiring. So the mystery here for anglerfish, and this is a family of fish, all deep sea fish, was that ichthyologists were puzzled for decades about where the males were, because all the fish, all the anglerfish that they got dredged up and studied were all females. So I didn't really understand where that was what was going on. Maybe there weren't no males. Maybe they were just someplace else, but it seemed a little odd that they would all be that way. Then a parasitologist started working on the external parasites that also were always very common on these fish and started poking around with them. And it turns out that's the male. So the male hangs down there on the ventral surface of the female. And the lifestyle here is that the deep sea is very dark. It's incredibly cold. There's not much food. And finding a mate is really difficult because if you advertise yourself that you're available to mate, you are also saying, I'm available to eat. So finding a mate is very difficult. What these fish do is that the larvae, when they're male, stay larvae, they swim around. And when they encounter a female, they glom onto her, they bite into the ventral surface near the anal fin, and they never let go. He just stays there. And his jaw dissolves, and it just blends into the female. And then soon his blood system is the same as the female. And then his gut disappears, his brain disappears. Just nothing but a testis is left. And then the female uses that to fertilize her eggs. And so he becomes an external other testis on the female and is part of their reproduction. So in some females, in some species, there's not just one male, but several. And how that gets worked out and how the female decides who to use, nobody has any idea whatsoever. But all the males in these anglerfish are this way. We know all kinds of stories about sex-changing fish as well. These fish don't change sex, they just have a different kind of family life. Later on, we can talk after this about Nemo, the real story, what really happened during Nemo, if you want. Well, we tried in this book to basically talk about the life of the ocean the way the life really was. And there's a way of writing environmental stories these days that unfortunately has a very peculiar story arc to it. That is, we do stuff like this, there's anglerfish or coral reefs or something, and how beautiful they are and wonderful, and they're just magnificent organisms, and they're fabulous and diverse and productive, and they're in a little bit of trouble, and we're doing these different things about them, and now they're in much more trouble, and they're about to go extinct, and the whole ecosystem is collapsing, and it's all your fault. So that's the narrative arc. You've heard it. You can only get away with that once or twice, because actually people get turned off by that, even if it is unfortunately true. So in our book, we tried to tell the stories of what these organisms did, and the way Tony put it was that you have to pay attention to the characters and understand what it is they're doing. So we didn't want every story to end with the bad news, but of course we had to face that because it was a book about the ocean and extreme lives in it. And so the last part of the book is about the kinds of changes that are going on in the ocean and the sorts of things that are going on with it. And we tried to write it in the same sort of way. So we needed to talk about overfishing and its role in changing community structure and its role in ecosystems, but it also has a very human element. And so, for example, the way we decided to tell this story is this one. I was in the Philippines a few years ago with a friend of mine named Amanda Vincent, and she's a seahorse biologist, and we were going out hunting seahorses with a seahorse fisherman. Not this fellow, but somebody very much like him. And we were out on a pongo, which is a Filipino dugout canoe, and we had our wetsuits, and we had our dive watches and our tanks and our regulators and our knives and our flashlights. We had thousands of dollars worth of stuff. And this guy had a very frayed pair of swim trunks. And he had carved his goggles by himself out of coconut husks and put the bottoms of Coke bottles into them. And he had a kerosene lamp that he put on the prow of the pronga, and he used that light to see with as he went free swimming down. So Amanda and I were down for about an hour. We found some seahorses. That was great. We had a good time. We got cold. We came back up. He took us back to the village and then went back out again. And he was out that night, I know, for another 7 hours. And he was out there every night for 7, 8, 9 hours. And in that period of time, he would get a seahorse, or maybe two. And when the Chinese medicinal collector came by to buy them, he could sell them for 25 cents each. And that meant that his family could eat rice the next day if he got a seahorse. Well, this is an example of really incredible overfishing, because these reefs have been fished by people for seahorses for a very, very, very long time. But this fisherman didn't want overfishing to happen. He didn't want to be out there for 8 hours every single night, catching just enough to keep his family only eating rice. He really did want things to be better. And in fact, those villages in the Philippines were really at the forefront of trying to change how fishing was allowed in some places and not others, so that populations could build back up again. But our point was we tried to tell the story from the standpoint of the fisherman, because it was the fisherman who was really hurting, and the distinction between our rich dive and his 8-hour very poor one was something that really struck all of us. So that is how we decided to tell that story. And it's because it's the characters that matter. Again, Tony said you don't care about the plot of anything until you care about the characters. So this book is about the characters of the ocean, how they live their lives, and then what we do, what we might do for them and with them. When we first were giving this talk, I would just blow through this slide, and then somebody always asked me, what is this thing? So I thought I'd just tell you. This is called a lookup fish. You can look it up. So It was discovered in Monterey Bay just about 25 years ago. They live about 1,000 feet deep, where the water is pretty dark, but you can still see the light filtering in from up above, and this fish eats jellyfish. And it comes into the jellyfish from below, sees their silhouette, and then comes up into and starts feeding on them. Well, it's basically coming up into the stinging tentacles of the jellyfish, which drapes over its head and stings its eyes, and it's a terrible mess. So this jellyfish has incredible adaptations to avoid that, and I'm going to sort of point them out because you're looking right at them, but you can't see them because they're so strange. They told me I couldn't leave the podium, so I can't walk over there and do it. But you see their eyes? That's not their eyes. That's their nostrils. The beak is their beak, but that's their nostrils. I am going to leave the podium because I'm going to show you their eyes. So those eyes have retreated back into the skull. The skull is transparent. The eyes are inside, and they've swiveled around so they're looking up. So the animal is looking up through its forehead, its transparent forehead, at the jellyfish, and as it comes into them and moves up and starts eating them, it doesn't matter that the tentacles drape over its head because its eyes are protected. So it's basically adapted itself to this very strange way of living and this very strange way of doing business with, in a way I think, honestly, very, very few of us would have guessed, would have imagined that would be the solution to this problem. But that's what goes on in the ocean, this kind of amazing adaptation. We do talk a little bit in the book about climate change. Because every time any of us goes out into the ocean, any of you who take classes, any of you who read books or newspapers, the changes that are coming that we can feel now and will be with us for the next couple of decades are alarming, and they can change the oceans in a huge amount. This is just different kinds of emissions. On the right there, on the left is the gigatons of carbon emitted over different periods of time. And on the right is the absolute concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere under different scenarios. Blue is business as usual. Yellow is the Paris scenario. And then the other two are somewhat in between. And I think it's safe to say that most marine biologists, virtually all marine biologists that I know, recognize that at 1,000 parts per million, which is up there where the blue line is, a vast fraction of ocean life that we know now just couldn't survive. Can't grow shells, your neurons don't function as well. The way the plants grow in the ocean is totally different. That kind of environment would make it impossible for coral reefs to grow, for example, because they have a skeleton that they need to make. So a great deal of what has gone into marine biology over the last little bit is what to do about climate change. And honestly, that's a kind of a conundrum when you're writing a book like this, because climate change is really important, but I can't solve climate change. Does that mean I'm useless? Right. No, doesn't mean I'm useless. I have to figure out what I'm good for, though, in this fight, because it's really important. So we came up with what we call the grand bargain. And that's that climate change has to be solved. We have to change it. That's going to come from the financial and economic and political part of our society and the religious part of our society that comes to grips with this big problem that's facing us all and our children and our grandchildren and solve it. And we have to do everything we can to help them any way we can solve that. But in the meantime, I'm a biologist, and I'm a conservation biologist and a marine biologist, and I have some skills and talents and energy. So I'm going to put that energy into saving as much as I can. So that in 100 years, when I firmly believe we will have conquered climate change and we'll be climbing out of it, that there will be more to grow back from. More kelp forests, more coral reefs, more seagrass beds, more oyster beds, more tuna, everything. And so that's the grand bargain. We do what we do in order to save what we can. We help the other part of our society solve climate change, and that together, I think will work. So that's how we decided to end the book. Just like we have problems, but we know the characters now, and we know the plot. And the characters are worth changing the plot for the oceans. Well, I'm going to sort of end with a video of manta rays on the Kona coast. This is a dive that my daughter Lauren made me do. It turned out one of the best 10 best dives I've ever done. It was just amazing. I'm just going to play this video, and it's going to end, and it's going to end too soon, and you're going to want more, and that's the point. So, I'm going to try. All right. Right? Thank you very much.
So we got time for a couple questions, and I saw one hand up over here, and then I'll catch you.
I know with all the discussion of climate change, everything like that, but in the last year, 2 years now, plastics have really become high focused, noticing islands in the Pacific with tons and tons of plastic. So what's your thoughts on that?
The question's about plastic as a problem, and you're totally right. Plastic is a huge problem everywhere. Not only the big plastic stuff that we see, but as it breaks down and forms microplastics, and the microplastics we now know are being consumed by all kinds of things that we eat. So it's plastic in the whole ecosystem again. I've been on a lot of panels and a lot of organizations that are trying to figure out what to do. And whatever most people kind of come down to is saying, once it's in the ocean, it's really hard to do anything about it. We can get some of it out. We can clean beaches, which is really fabulous, and gets people the idea that, oh yeah, this is a problem. So that's a great thing. But keeping it out of the ocean is the most important thing. And it goes from doing simple things like not using plastic bags in the grocery store, which seems sort of silly, but you can do that, and it does help. To really reducing single-use plastics in your own home or what you're doing. If you've ever been to places where they no longer give you plastic straws, it's because a bunch of 12-year-olds and 11-year-olds have been really pushing the idea we don't need plastic straws because it hurts wildlife. So there are things like that that I think you can do, and then other people trying to figure out how do you keep plastics from getting in rivers in Southeast Asia that go into the ocean. So it's really sparked a huge amount of effort into trying to solve that kind of problem, and I totally support that.
Ooh, mine is a way less meaningful question. I was just wondering, what's the gestation period for bowhead whales?
What is the gestation period for bowhead whales? I believe it's kind of whale-like, about 9 or 10 months, but it could be 2 years, and I honestly don't remember. Was that like a question on your final, right?
So I've heard about a type of jellyfish that goes back in their life cycle. They go from the baby stage, then up to their adulthood and whatnot, but then reverse back to the baby stage. How do those things, how are they in terms of longevity, lifespan for the longest creatures?
So we do have a little section about them in the book, and you're totally right. You can take a jellyfish and reverse it. You can basically reverse it back into larval stage, and then it'll go forward again, and you can reverse it back. So you can basically turn the clock back. on those. But that's a lab manipulation. Most of the time in the ocean, they're just doing their normal jellyfish thing of living and breeding and going on from there. So they're kind of normal, except that under certain conditions, we can reverse what their cells do. What's interesting about that is nothing we can do will reverse that for us. And so figuring that out has been what people have been really jazzed about for those, what they call the immortal jellyfish.
I had a little point of confusion concerning the coral and previous things I read in my life. I understand that they are a colony.
Mm-hmm.
So you're saying this particular kind of coral, this particular section or colony could be 4,270 years old.
Right.
But that does not refer to the individuals.
Right. So that's a great question. And the thing about them, we call them a colony, but it's not like a colony of seagulls. A colony of corals is a set of genetically identical little modules. They're more akin to like a tree with different leaves, and each of the leaves is a module. And the coral, the leaf is a polyp, got tentacles around it and a mouth, and it can live and do all the stuff that any other little animal can do. But they're all growing together in this unit that's all the same genome. So it was born at a particular time back in the past, and then the whole structure has grown like that. So when we call it a colony, it's a little bit different. It's almost like a cell, exactly, yeah.
I read in a Weird But True book that someone saw like a white humpback whale. Is it true that there's white humpback whales?
So the question is it true that there are white humpback whales? And I didn't read that, so I didn't see that, but there's lots of mammals that have albino forms, and it wouldn't surprise me if there were an albino humpback whale. Humpback whales, of course, have lots of different colors and color patterns. They're dark on the top and light underneath. It's also possible that that particular animal just was mostly white and didn't happen to have the black that most of them have. Great question. Albino means that you don't have any of the color that makes like your hair black. I mean, my hair used to be black. It's that pigment that makes for darker color for eyebrows or hair or skin, and that could be in mice or wolves or people. There's albino individuals of all those, so maybe a whale too. Great question, thank you.
What is the lookup fish's skull composed of? How does the transparency work?
How does the transparency work on the lookup fish? I don't know exactly, but for example, most fish have the bones are made with calcium carbonate, but there's a lot of cartilage too, and so I'm going to presume that dome is mostly made of cartilage, and it doesn't have much calcium carbonate in it. It might not be as tough and as stiff as a regular skull. So I'll presume that, and I'm sure you can look that up too. But on that same topic, the weirdest thing about that is a very extinct kind of organism called a trilobite. Anybody heard of trilobites? Right, they're really neat crustaceans. They got up to about this big. They lived in the Cambrian explosion 550 million years ago and died out a couple hundred million years ago. They had eyes, like compound eyes like insects do. The lenses on their eyes were made of calcium carbonate. There's a kind of calcium carbonate crystal that's transparent. And so trilobites had transparent calcium carbonate eyes. So I just think that's cool.
Is the pollution getting worse or better in the ocean?
Is pollution getting worse or better in the ocean? By and large, pollution is getting worse.
Like the plastic?
I'm sorry?
Like the plastic?
So like the plastic, but like almost everything. So sediment and sewage and chemicals and fertilizer is getting worse in the ocean. Partly it's because more people are living on the coast, and so what people do on the coast tends to wash into the ocean. It's partly because there's more of us and partly because we have more industry. So all of that, we tend to use the ocean as like the dumping ground. And we used to think that whatever we put in the ocean was fine because it would just be diluted. But now there's so many of us and all around the coast that that dilution can't really work so well. And that's why local efforts to stem pollution really work, because you can do that locally and that makes your stretch of coast better. Your bay here, your river can be more pollutant free if you do that locally. And that's something that people all around the world are discovering makes it better for their community.
I heard from somewhere that sailfish can change their colors depending on whether they're excited or not. Is that true?
You know, I've seen some sailfish change colors a little bit, but nothing like, say, squid and octopus change their colors. Squid and octopus can flash you a poem with their colors. It's just an amazing amount of communication they do. So sailfish are not quite doing that. They do raise and lower that sail, though. And so there's videos you can go online and you can see sailfish, you know, as they're sort of cruising around at relatively low speed, they can all of a sudden flap that dorsal fin up and use it as a signaling device. Either they're startled or they're using it to signal the other fish around.
I had read some time back about the ocean currents coming from the Arctic, coming down across the Atlantic, had changed.
Could you raise your hand because I'm not seeing where you are? Oh, thank you.
And the currents had changed due to the climate change. Could you speak to the current thinking on how ocean currents are responding to the climate change, please?
So currents, there's like local currents and global currents. So local currents change with climate because of the way the wind blows and because of the way local heating goes. Like even along this coast, upwelling can be a lot stronger some years than others, and that's because deep water coming up. And along here, folks and in Corvallis had discovered as that water comes up from deep, it's cold and it's more acidified and it doesn't have much oxygen either. And so those large hypoxic events that have been going around Oregon have been because of these changes in currents. But then there's the global currents that people worry about a lot. Currents that move water from the poles, and the water gets really cold and sinks and then heads to the tropics and then comes back up and goes. So there's a conveyor belt of ocean currents that goes from the equator out to the poles and back. And it's like a heat exchange system. It keeps the tropics a little cooler and the poles a little warmer than they would otherwise. The Gulf Stream is a good example of that in the Atlantic. People worry about that cycle stopping when glacial melt and the Arctic ice packs begin to break. And then what will happen to the whole globe's climate when that happens, people don't quite know, but that would be a big, huge change almost overnight. Cheery.
Do you agree? Do you agree that overpopulation, human overpopulation, is the greatest threat to the planet, ultimately?
So the question is overpopulation the greatest threat to the planet? The threats to the planet we have right now are because of people, and as they grow, those threats get better. But in my mind, there's another part of the equation. It's not just the number of people, but the resources that the people use and their footprint on the planet. So when I tend to think about it, I tend to think of those two things together, that it's not just a question of reducing the human population. It's really a question of reducing the footprint of humans on the planet. And you can do that with more humans and less footprint. So I'll just leave it at the idea that how we live on the planet is just as important as how many of us there are. And we actually can change that individually right now.
So you'd said with the deep sea anglers that the males would attach to the females, and
So I was just wondering if sometimes the female's body would reject the male's body due to different antibodies or things like that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So usually in all other vertebrates, our immune systems would prevent that from happening. But as far as we know, it does not happen in the anglerfish. And as far as I know, no one has studied that and no one has figured that out. But they must have some change to their immune system that would allow that to happen. It'd be like having a tissue graft from another person. We couldn't do that, but they can. So again, it's an opportunity to find out how these marine organisms live their lives that might be useful to us.
I got 2 more questions, and then we'll take it to the lobby.
Hi.
Thank you. Yeah, I was just...
Hi. So I was wondering if it's true that seagulls are becoming cannibalistic because of climate change.
Boy, I think they've always been cannibalistic. I've worked on the outer coast of Washington for years and years and years and did study sites in seagull rookeries. I'm not a fan of seagulls.
Who is?
I think I've watched seagulls eat, I've watched adults eat baby seagulls all the time. So I don't think they can blame that on us. Let's put it.
Some years ago, I had heard that they were doing studies on the genetics of sharks to possibly develop that for human regrowth of teeth. Is that true, or is that still in the works?
I don't know, honestly. They're regenerating teeth in a very different way than we would. I mean, is that what you would really want to do? It'd be better just to brush your teeth. So I'm getting silly, but but I'll end on a science note. There are other marine organisms that can actually regenerate things that we really would like to know how. There's marine organisms that can regenerate their brains. Even hemichordates, the sort of cousin to us chordates, they have a brain structure of the same 3 parts like we do. But if you slice their brain in half, they can regrow it. So I have colleagues at the Hopkins Marine Station that are trying to understand regeneration and how other organisms can do things we can't. And I think that's got some real promise. Thank you.
So thank you all for coming out tonight. I'd like to give a heartfelt thank you to Steve for making time in his schedule. And also to all of you for coming out, whether this is the first talk you've been to or many. I appreciate your support as well. So thanks all, and hope to see you in October.
Thank you.
And Steve will be out in the lobby afterwards so that we'll be able to free up our IT people so they can go home and start their weekend too. Thanks, guys.